All right, so get this picture. Sylvester Stallone introducing the President of the United States.
Wow.
And Elon Musk is more worried about politics than he is about launching rockets.
Sounds like a movie.
It does, right?
Yeah.
But this isn't some Hollywood script. This was the scene at a recent America First Policy Institute gala.
Really?
Yeah, and it gives us a fascinating peek into what's driving conservative policy today.
Absolutely. And you know what you've given me here is like a goldmine.
Yeah.
A speech by Donald Trump at this AFPI gala, Foreign Policy Insights from the Center for Renewing America, and reports on a whole bunch of conservative think tanks.
Yeah, it's a lot. So our mission, if we choose to accept it, is to understand what's behind this America First movement.
Okay.
Especially their focus on education reform.
Right.
And then how these think tanks are actually turning these ideas into policy.
Sounds good.
So, should we start with Trump's speech at the gala?
Yeah, let's do it.
So he's claiming this huge political victory. And it's really interesting how he's highlighting the increasing number of Black and Hispanic voters who are siding with Republicans.
Yeah, it's a pretty big demographic shift. And I think it reflects how American politics is changing.
Yeah.
Trump says this is partly because of his focus on things like border security.
Okay.
And economic anxieties, like rising grocery prices, things that really connect with voters, regardless of race or ethnicity.
Yeah, he definitely hammered on this idea of common sense throughout the speech.
He did.
What do you make of that?
What seems like a strategic appeal to this kind of longing for traditional values, like a rejection of what he sees as extreme or radical policies. He even used the phrase child sexual mutilation.
Oh, wow.
In this context. He was referring to gender-affirming care for transgender youth, which has become a really, really controversial topic.
Yeah, for sure. So it seems like America First is more than just a slogan.
I think so.
It's a whole framework for how to approach everything, from the economy to, as we're going to get to, education. It's exact.
It represents this shift in priorities, a focus on domestic strength, stability. It echoes what the Center for Renewing America is saying about foreign policy. They want to move away from these endless foreign wars and prioritize American interests at home first.
Before we jump into the education debate, though, there's one thing in Trump's speech that I just have to ask about.
Okay.
He, just out of the blue, announced Doug Burgum as his nominee for the Department of Interior, right there at the gala.
It was a dramatic move, maybe meant to really show his commitment to this America First agenda. And to get his base excited, Burgum is the current governor of North Dakota, and he's known for his conservative views on energy and the environment, which really lines up with the movement's focus on energy independence and less regulation.
Okay, interesting. So let's shift gears now and talk about education.
Right.
Because this seems to be a major battleground for the America First movement.
Yes, and we have a very interesting perspective on this from law professor Amy Wax, who was interviewed on the Claremont Institute's The Roundtable podcast.
Okay.
She really doesn't paint a very positive picture of the American education system.
Yeah, from what I gathered, it's not just about budget cuts or teacher shortages.
Right.
She's saying the system itself is broken.
Exactly. Wax argues that schools are failing to teach kids basic skills, reading, math, and instead are pushing this woke ideology that undermines traditional values and parental authority. She sees this as a deliberate attempt to indoctrinate kids.
Wow. She even gave an example from her own life. Her daughter had to go to a school that was still using this whole language approach to teaching reading.
Oh, yeah, the whole language approach that emphasizes meaning and comprehension, often using children's literature and encouraging kids to guess words from the context. Wax compares this with the phonics approach, which focuses on teaching kids the relationship between letters and sounds.
Right.
And she argues that phonics is proven to be more effective.
Okay.
Especially for kids who struggle with reading.
So it's like she sees this as a tiny example of a bigger problem.
Yeah.
Schools clinging to an ideology even though the evidence says it's not working.
That's a good point. And she's calling for a radical reactionary approach to education, taking inspiration from her own experience in 1960s New York public schools.
Wow.
She wants to go back to a more traditional style, emphasizing discipline, rote learning, and focusing on those core academic subjects.
Interesting. So less social emotional learning and more multiplication tables.
That's the idea, yeah.
So we're hearing this call to go back to a more traditional way of teaching.
Right.
But how do these ideas actually become policies? Who's figuring out what to do?
That's where these conservative think tanks step in. They're like think factories,
Yeah.
developing research and coming up with policy proposals that fit with this America First vision.
Okay.
We have a whole list of them in our sources. The Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, the Hoover Institution, just to name a few.
It's interesting how these think tanks all believe in limited government and individual freedom.
Yeah.
But they each bring something a little different to the table.
Yeah, they each have their own focus, their own expertise. Some are all about economics, free markets, less regulation.
Right.
Others concentrate on foreign policy, a strong military, being assertive globally. And then others really dive into social issues, often with a more traditional viewpoint.
And what I found really helpful were the SWOT analyses.
Oh, yeah.
For each think tank.
Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats.
Yeah, it's like a cheat sheet
It is.
to understanding how they work.
Yeah, those SWOT analyses give us a peek into how these organizations see themselves, their goals, and the challenges they face. It's fascinating to see how they identify their own weaknesses
Right.
and the strategies they might use to overcome them.
But let's get back to education and this fight against woke ideology that Amy Wax was talking about, which think tanks are really tackling this head on.
Well, several of them are, including the Claremont Institute, where Amy Wax is a senior fellow,
Okay.
the Manhattan Institute, and the Center for Renewing America. They're all pushing for policies to take back control of education from what they see as a progressive establishment.
So let's get specific. What policies are they proposing?
One big one is defunding education schools.
Okay.
The argument is that these schools have become like breeding grounds for progressive ideology, which then filters down into K-12. By cutting funding, they hope to weaken the influence of these schools.
So it's about going after the root of the problem. What other tactics are they using?
They're pushing for tougher teacher testing and stricter certification requirements. The idea is to raise the bar for who gets to teach and make sure educators have strong understanding of core subjects, not just the latest social justice theories. Some even propose taking control of teacher certification away from state departments of education and giving it to independent boards made up of subject matter experts.
Makes sense. Make sure teachers really know their stuff.
Didn't Wax also mention something about Title VI?
She did. That's another avenue they're exploring. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act bans discrimination based on race, color, or national origin in any program that receives federal funding. These think tanks want to use Title VI to force colorblind admissions in schools, basically getting rid of any consideration of race or ethnicity in the admissions process.
So that would be a direct challenge to affirmative action. That's going to be controversial.
Absolutely. Another hot-button issue is the role of teachers' unions.
Yeah.
Many of these think tanks see unions as a big roadblock to reform. They argue that unions prioritize their members over the needs of students.
So what are they suggesting? Get rid of the unions, weaken them somehow.
There are different proposals, from right-to-work laws that would make joining a union optional, to limiting collective bargaining rights. Some even want to abolish teacher tenure, arguing that it protects bad teachers and makes it hard to get rid of them.
Sounds like a major overhaul of the system.
It is. What about the Department of Education itself? Some conservatives want to get rid of it completely.
Yeah, they see it as too bureaucratic, too intrusive, and too aligned with progressive ideology. They say it's time to give control of education back to the states and local communities.
So it's all about decentralization.
Exactly. Local control. But there isn't total agreement on this, even within the conservative movement.
Not really.
Yeah, not every think tank wants to abolish the Department of Education. Some think it still has a role to play, maybe a smaller one. They argue that it could be used to promote conservative education reforms and push back against the progressive agenda,
Okay.
maybe by tying federal funding to specific policy changes at the state level.
It's interesting how there are different views, even within a movement that agrees on some basic principles.
Yeah, it's important to remember that these are complicated issues, with valid arguments on both sides. Finding the right balance between federal oversight and local autonomy is something policymakers have been struggling with for a long time.
We're seeing this tension play out in other areas, too, not just education. It reminds me of some of the other things Trump talked about in his speech, like the rising cost of living and how to address economic worries.
Yeah, and that leads to a really interesting question.
What's that?
Could some of the strategies we've been talking about for education reform, like school choice and empowering parents, be used in other areas like welfare or healthcare?
So instead of just giving direct aid, we should focus on giving people the power to make their own choices and control their own lives.
Exactly. This fits with the core beliefs of the America First movement.
Okay.
Individual responsibility, limited government intervention, and a belief in free markets and competition.
So it's about creating a system where everyone has a chance to succeed,
Right.
but in the end, it's up to each person to take advantage of those opportunities.
That's the essence of the American dream, isn't it?
Right.
The belief that hard work, determination, and a level playing field can lead to success and happiness. Of course, the reality is often much more complicated. There are barriers and inequalities that need to be addressed.
Yeah.
But this idea of individual agency is still a powerful force in American political thought.
So are these conservative think tanks basically trying to bring back that sense of individual agency and responsibility?
I think they would say they are. They see a society that's become too dependent on the government, where people have lost their power and initiative. They think that by shrinking the government, promoting free markets, and emphasizing traditional values, they can unleash people's potential
Okay.
and create a better, more successful society.
It's a powerful vision.
Yeah.
But some would say it ignores the reality of inequality
Right.
and the role of government in making sure society is fair.
Exactly. And that's where things get really heated. Critics say these think tanks are pushing policies that help the rich and powerful at the expense of the poor and marginalized. They argue that cutting social safety nets, deregulating industries, and restricting access to things like reproductive health care will only make existing inequalities worse and create a more divided society.
It's interesting how these think tanks are connecting all these different issues, like education welfare, healthcare, even foreign policy.
They see a common thread running through all of them: the need to restore individual liberty, limit government power, and promote traditional values. They believe that by applying these principles consistently, they can create a better, more secure society that reflects their vision of American greatness.
It's a bold agenda, to say the least,
It is.
and one that will have a big impact on the future of American society. It's really clear that these conservative think tanks have a big influence on the policy debate, especially within this America First movement.
Yeah, their influence is huge. They're the ones providing the ideas, the plans, and the platforms to push their agenda and shape public opinion.
We've heard from politicians and experts and academics, but you know what I'm thinking.
What's-
We haven't really heard from the people who are most affected by these policies.
You mean?
Students and teachers.
That's a really good point. It is important to think about the perspectives of those who are actually in the education system every day. How do students feel about what they're learning? How do they feel about the teaching methods and just the overall school environment? What are the challenges and rewards of teaching in today's world?
Yeah. Are their voices even being heard in all of this? Are their concerns being addressed?
Those are good questions. Maybe some of these think tanks are talking to students and teachers, doing surveys or focus groups to get feedback. But we don't see that in the sources we have here.
It makes you wonder if these policy debates are getting too far removed from the actual experiences of the people they're supposed to be helping.
That's a valid concern. Policymakers need to be careful not to just impose solutions from above without really understanding the needs and views of those who will be most impacted.
This whole deep dive has been really eye-opening.
It has.
We've looked at the core ideas of the America First movement, gone deep into the complexities of education reform, and examined how these conservative think tanks are shaping policy.
We've seen how they're connecting seemingly unrelated issues, from education to welfare to foreign policy, all under this shared ideological umbrella.
And even though we've mostly focused on the conservative viewpoint, it's important to remember that there are many different sides to these issues and potential solutions.
Absolutely. This deep dive has given you a strong foundation, but it's just the start of a much bigger ongoing conversation.
So to our listener, I encourage you to keep exploring these issues, look for different viewpoints, have thoughtful discussions, and most importantly, think about how these policies might affect your own life and the lives of those around you.
Remember, knowledge is power, and by learning more about these complex issues, you can become a more informed and engaged citizen, someone who can contribute to a more thoughtful and productive dialogue about the future of our nation.